Speaker, I move passage for House Bill 2124 on third and final consideration.
Representative Grills moves passage. Probably seconded. Mr. Clerk, any amendment's been filed?
Mr. Speaker, no amendment filed.
Representative Grills, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the past few weeks, criminal illegal aliens have murdered a nursing student in Georgia, murdered a 2-year-old in Maryland, murdered a 16-year-old in Texas, sexually assaulted a child in Virginia, raped a 14-year-old at knife point in Louisiana, stabbed another man repeatedly in Louisiana. Just this past weekend, the West Tennessee Drug Task Force confiscated 85 pounds of fentanyl on I-40 from an illegal alien. That's enough fentanyl to kill 19 million people. This legislation requires that law enforcement officers in the state communicate with the Department of Homeland Security when they encounter a person in the country illegally. And with that, I renew my motion, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Grill renews his motion. Any discussion on the bill? Representative Pearson, you're recognized.
Thank you so much, Speaker. Obviously, and this came through our committee, I believe this type of legislation is detrimental. I think it is harmful. I think it is rooted in racism and xenophobia that only creates more problems, and turning that into legislation is not something that we should be doing. I asked you about this in committee and just wanted to see if you learned any more information about the 287G program and how this legislation, which would force local law enforcement to engage with the federal government, how that would actually happen without there being a memorandum of agreement or understanding with those agencies.
Representative Grills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just communicating with the Department of Homeland Security is not that, so it would not affect the 287G program.
Representative Pearson.
Thank you. So here's the problem. The effort that you are making is to turn local law enforcement into federal officials, to federal law enforcement. It's the federal government's job to deal with immigration. It is not the job of our police departments. It is not the job of our sheriffs. They've got enough problems to deal with. And you mentioned a whole lot of things that you say people who are immigrants committed acts of, but there have been 74 mass shootings in the United States of America, nearly one for every single day. Most violence that is actually committed is committed by citizens. Non-citizens commit 30% less crime than citizens. And so this hyperbole, this political rhetoric is nothing but something to fuel and stoke the fires of xenophobia, to fuel and stoke the fires of separation, and that is wrong and immoral. The 287G program has two models, a jail enforcement model, a warrant service officer model. And to participate, jurisdictions sign a memorandum of agreement with ICE, state and local law enforcement officers participating in the 287G program have all of these qualifications that they must do, but by doing so, they are then able to communicate the things that you are articulating to the federal government. Absent this, I do not see how this would even be possible to be implemented. And the reality is, in Davidson County, this was tried, and they stopped doing it. In Knox County, this was tried, and they ended up being in court about it. There is no way that we can actually force local law enforcement to increase the amount of work that they are doing without one of these agreements being in place. And so your legislation ignores the reality of implementation, which is why it is a very weak piece of legislation that needs more time if it were ever to be considered. This type of legislation is dangerous. This is dangerous. When you have people who march in Nashville and in Tennessee advocating against immigrants and saying people who are Mexican need to be deported, and then we have racist legislation that we seek to pass that helps to support these very negative ideologies, this is wrong. This is not how you address a crisis. This is not how you are intentional or pay attention to how we solve something. This continues what I have unfortunately seen in too many resolutions and too many bills that have been passed and that have sought to be passed. This continues a very false sense of security. This isn't going to do anything to meaningfully address the reality of immigrants who are seeking asylum, people who are fleeing all of the places that they are fleeing because they are seeking what many people here seem to care about, or at least talk about, the American dream. But the American dream seems to only matter if you look a particular way. The American dream only seems to matter if you come from a particular place, but if you're fleeing countries due to violence, if you're fleeing places due to humanitarian issues, we are turning our back on those individuals, and that is immoral and wrong. It is not to discount the realities, and some of the stats that you mentioned may be true. But if we only legislate and advocate for legislation because of these very extreme examples, and we do not recognize the beauty that exists within the people who come to our borders, the people who are on our shores seeking a better life, we will injure ourselves, we will injure our communities, we will injure the people who do help to make America the country that it is and can be. And so instead of false solutions, xenophobic solutions, let us be intentional about real solutions to include real solutions to make people human and treat them with dignity and respect. That is not what this legislation does, and that's why I ask that you all oppose it.
Representative Grills, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm going to surprise some of you here because I actually agree with President Biden on an issue. 2 weeks ago, on February 28th, the White House spokesperson stated, "We